Appendix 1, Christian Ontology, marginalia. Just what you were waiting for, a crash course on the influence of ancient philosophy on Christian theology. Particular care is taken to point out the philosophical underpinnings of the ontological switch in primacy from what to who. She also explains how confusing person with individual leads to monophysitism and Hinduism. So I would definitely not want to dismiss this chapter as just a dive into scholasticism. I would prefer to think of this chapter as an inquiry into the history of the ideas that have gotten us to where we are. So it may seem a little nitpicky at times, but clarity and precision, I think, is what she's after. Of course, she's repetitive as always. It's 20 pages long, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The concern of ontology is not that something exists, but what it is that exists. What is its essential or real nature. It is also the inquiry into what causes a thing to be what it is and how things differ according to genus and species. What are called ontological categories are the basic divisions into which everything can be divided, its major divisions being element, plant, animal, and human natures. Although God transcends all possible ontological categories, yet the existence, essence, or nature of God has always been the object of inquiry. What we want to point out in this chapter is the difference between a Platonic and Aristotelian view of man and its impact on Christology. The difference between the two would bring about another strategic switch from the earlier, more Platonic understanding of Christ to the much later medieval understanding that would come to dominate Christology. From medieval times to this day, all Orthodox Christologies would be premised on what the scholastics regarded as Aristotle's view of man. So just as the general mindset at the time of the early fathers was basically Platonic, the medieval mindset of the scholastics would become Aristotelian. This then was another one of those switches that can be pointed out when chasing down the devolution of Christianity into a Jesus cult. It would be possible to divide Christianity into two major Christologies, that of the early fathers and the later medieval group called the scholastics. It is because the Eastern Orthodox Church adheres mainly to the early fathers of its Christology, is regarded as representing a more mystical understanding of Christ, and the Western Church the more rational or intellectual understanding. Although both share more in common than not, yet with different backgrounds, their theology of Christ and the Trinity is presented quite differently. While we do not want to go over the pros and cons of their differences, such as we find in the later Western Church, while we do not want to go over the pros and cons of their differences, we must make clear the early fathers were not students of philosophy such as we find in the later Western Church. In the Eastern Church, if one did not know God, the Trinity, or Christ experientially, then they could not be regarded as authentic theologians. Thus, if one does not himself experientially know God and Christ, then he really should not say anything. The Orthodox have a saying that the theologian is the man on his knees. To recognize this switch from the original understanding of Christ, however, would entail some knowledge of these two philosophies and their ontological view of reality. Where Plato presents us with a broad-based universal as the ontologically real, Aristotle narrows it down to the individual as the ontologically real. You've seen the picture of Plato with his hand going like this, pointing up, and then Aristotle is going like this. It's all about what's on Earth. Anyway, sorry. Thus, Christ, originally regarded as universal man, is narrowed down to being an individual man. Jesus, that is. I want to repeat that. Thus, Christ, originally regarded as universal man, is narrowed down to being an individual man, Jesus, that is. This was a big switch. As to how the ontological reality of being went from Plato's universal to Aristotle's individual was by defining individual as a person. Aristotle, of course, never defined individual as person. It was Christianity that used Aristotle to back up its own idea of person, give it some philosophical rationale, or cover its tracks, we might say. This is why they latched onto Boethius' definition of person as an individual being. While the fathers had no immediate concern with the philosophical notion of ontological being, this concern turned out to be the result of their centuries of disputes over the true meaning of the term hypostasis, and in the West, the term substance. Was this a reference to the one nature, essence of God, or a reference to the Trinity as three particular individuals, three persons, as this would be defined? Is the Trinity what God is, or is the Trinity who God is? As a result of this dichotomy between nature and person, swords were drawn on both sides. It could be said the major concern of scholastic philosophy was to find some philosophical rationale to underpin or prop up its doctrinal dictums and beliefs. Although the Eastern Church scoffs at Western scholasticism as so much intellectual confusion, do not think for a minute the East did not take anything from it. It is quite possible to show how Aristotelianism impacted the East, show what the East took from the scholastics that it would have been best to reject. In the era of the Fathers, Platonism and Stoicism were the leading philosophies. This was the educated mindset in which their understanding of Christ took root. It would be 1,000 years before the scholastic Aristotelians took over the Christian mindset we have today. What is unfortunate, however, is those who write the history of the early development of Christian thought and doctrine consistently rely on the present-day Aristotelian rendition of it. It could be said this is a deliberate attempt to eliminate any possible Platonic understanding of Christ as a universal in order to make Christ solely one particular man, Jesus, of course. It has been said that in the early centuries, Aristotle's works, namely Physics, much later renamed Metaphysics, and Psyche, later renamed De Anima, or the soul, were virtually unknown. Yet there is no evidence for this. Given the religious fervor of the times, Aristotle's works simply had nothing to offer. He had no impact in the early centuries taken up with Plato and Stoicism. He was a renowned scientist and logician, not a metaphysician. It remains a mystery why his original book titles were changed, because everything he wrote of any metaphysical significance can probably be reduced to 10 pages or so. Marginalia. It just came after his book called Physics, ergo Metaphysics. Back to the text. Like everyone else, however, he has undergone various translations, and, like everyone else, there is no end to various interpretations. There can be no question, however, when Western Christianity discovered Aristotle in the 12th century or so, he was given a Christian understanding, and this, of course, is our sole concern. So what we want to point out here is another one of those major theological or Christological switches that came about with the discovery of Aristotle, a change in the ontological definition of man. Taken from Boethius' rendition of Aristotle's definition of man as, quote, an individual substance of a rational nature, end quote, the Christian ontological definition of man became person. Thus, the essence of man, or what man is now a person. A person who owns or has a body and soul. So the switch is from the ontological essence of what man is, human nature, to who man is, a person. This, of course, is Boethius' definition